This second lesson to our morning worship is the epitome of Paul's argument, Paul's letter to the church at Rome. So important is it that scholars have called it the Symphony, Paul's Symphony. And in fact, Bach wrote a cantata based on this passage. So eloquent is it. Paul scholars will tell you that whenever a verse starts or somewhere in the beginning of the verse is the little word therefore, find out what it's there for. Romans chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. I invite you to follow along in your pew Bible or simply listen for the Word of God as I read these words. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Jesus Christ. For the law of the Spirit of life in Jesus Christ has set you free from the law of sin and death. For God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do, by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and to deal with sin. He condemns sin in the flesh so that the just requirements of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set their mind on the things of the Spirit. To set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. For this reason, the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. And those who are in the flesh cannot please God. But you are not in the flesh. You are in the Spirit, since the Spirit of God dwells in you. Anyone who does not have the Spirit of God does not belong to God. But if Christ is in you, though the body is dead because of sin, the Spirit is life because of righteousness. If the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give your life to your mortal bodies, also through his Spirit that dwells in you. This is the word of the Lord. Over the last 20 or 30 years, there has been a really quite remarkable reappraisal, reinterpretation of Paul's theology, and in particular, getting at the book of Romans, which is considered Paul's magnum opus, I guess you could say. Some think of it that way, and it's especially critical for us Protestants because Romans virtually launched the Reformation. As Martin Luther read Romans and then coined the credo of the Reformation, which is that salvation comes by grace through faith and not through works. I hope you have heard that before, that credo. It's enshrined in virtually everything Protestant. Even in our Presbyterian Book of Order, it is right there, and in all of our confessions and creeds. The unfortunate history of that credo, though, is that it tends to pit Protestant grace with the perceived works righteousness of virtually everybody else, in particular Catholics and Jews. And as it has done that, it has tended to stereotype all of the above. And frankly, whatever was the case in Martin Luther's day, it's hardly the case today. And so scholars are starting to see that we have been reading the book of Romans and maybe all of Paul's theology through the interpretive dome of the Protestant Reformation, in particular Luther and, yes, Calvin. We've done that. Reappraisal has tried to go back and look at it through different angles and different lenses. And in particular, one of the most interesting things that's come out of that is the notion that Paul was less concerned with individual salvation than Paul was concerned with the politics, the broken politics of his day. And by using the word politics, I'm not talking about Republicans and Democrats, although something that Paul has to say might be relevant for both of those groups. But really he's talking about polis, the city, the way we organize life. And really Paul's concerned about the brokenness of the cosmos. A little bit later in Romans, Paul talks about how the cosmos itself, the creation, is struggling under human sin and yearning for redemption. That's the vision Paul's got. It's a very large vision. It's about the vision of the world. And there are many aspects of this new appraisal of Paul's theology. But one that has captured my attention in recent years is the social-scientific work done on the ancient Mediterranean world on shame and honor. On shame and honor. As the theory goes, as the social scientists have looked back in the Mediterranean world that engulfed Paul and all of the New Testament world, it was a world of shame and honor, and those who were honored were of the upper class, and it was a very competitive kind of thing. What you really wanted to do was usurp someone else's reputation in order to achieve honor and thereby shaming them. Now this happened on one level, that is the upper class, because everybody else was in the status quo of shame. Okay? Everybody else. It wasn't a pyramid, it was more like a totem pole. And it was pervasive, according to the people that have looked at this stuff. A very fine biblical scholar, Robert Jewett, has looked at this and taken the categories of shame and honor of the ancient world, and he has peered through Paul's letters, in particular Paul's letter to the Romans, but also 1 Corinthians, and seen the shame-honor system as kind of the assumption from which Paul writes. And so when he comes to Romans, Robert Jewett says that Paul really is trying to apply what he found prior in his letter to the Corinthians, that the cross is the ultimate shame. Because Jesus was the ultimate outsider, the ultimate shamed. And so what Paul says is what is shamefulness for some, foolishness for others, is the wisdom of God seeking to reverse the shame that we experience in the world, the shame of the totem pole. That's what Paul was trying to get at. So the cross is, in a sense, shatters that shame and reverses the world and tries to turn it upside down. And especially is addressing those who are shamed and feel themselves so. What the cross does is it shatters a world in which the strong have preference over the weak. It shatters the world in which the educated have preference over the ill-educated or the slave. It shatters the world of race and class difference, where the Greek and the Roman have preference over the barbarian. And that word barbarian needs to be carefully nuanced, because as it was used in the ancient world, it was equivalent to the N-word for us. Paul uses that word and lifts it up and says that it's reversed. It's reversed by the cross. It's a very powerful argument as you look at it. My wife would remind me, if she was here today, to tell you it's not the whole of the way we want to look at these things, but it's a really interesting interpretive nuance to try to get at Paul's letter. A very difficult letter, I think you'll agree, to the church at Rome. And many of you, as I'm talking about shame and honor, are probably, no doubt, if you watch YouTube, you are no doubt thinking about Brene Brown and her YouTube TED Talks on shame that have gone viral. If you haven't seen them, you need to do it. Some people think it's kind of self-help kind of stuff, and I mean, it does come off a little bit that way, but Brene Brown is a heavyweight scholar. She teaches at University of Houston. She's a PhD in social work. She's a researcher and has done her homework on the whole notion of shame and how it manifests itself in our lives and in our world. Shame she says, is the feeling of just not being good enough, of not being loved, of not being loved. The feeling of just not being good enough. And so perfectionism comes out of shame. Many other social ailments come out of shame, she says. Shame, she says, lurks behind virtually everything, from appearance to our body image, to the clothes that we wear, to our family situation, to our work, to everything. She doesn't do much with race, class, and poverty issues, but I surely think it applies. The Thursday morning prayer group, of which I'm an honored part, just got done reading Brene Brown's fine book. I commend it to you. It's entitled Daring Greatly. I don't just commend it to you. Go out and buy it. I don't seldom do capitalism here, but I go out and buy this thing. It's a good book. It's a worthy book. And let's talk. Let's talk afterwards. One of the things that somebody brought me up short about asking the question and pointing out what Brene Brown does in this book, and especially the last chapters that we were reading on Thursday, was what she does with blame. In fact, I was really brought up short with the conversation because my wife tells me that I'm really good at blame. It's kind of my missile defense system, if you know what I mean. Kind of like the Iron Dome of the world. I don't know if I agree with her on that. I'll take what she says. I mean, I kind of do it, but she says that every time there's a stopped up sink or the milk carton is empty, that I'm the first to target somebody to blame. Even if I'm later reminded that I was the last one to use the milk and the last one to use the sink. But, you know, I say to her, somebody's got to do it right, and I'm a ready judge and jury, you know? I can come to your house and do it too if you like. Here's what Brene Brown says about it. It's a really interesting phrase. She says, when blame is in the driver's seat, shame is riding shotgun. Let me do that again. When blame is in the driver's seat, shame is riding shotgun. What she means by that is that when we feel shamed, we lash out. When we feel pain, when we feel that we are unloved, we lash out. That's what we do. We demonize sometimes. It's kind of part and parcel of the human condition. I don't know if there's an exact correlation between what these scholars are seeing in the Mediterranean world as shame and what Brene Brown talks about, but even if there's a loose connection in our common condition, it's interesting to say the least. And what we asked on Thursday was the question of sin. How does shame and blame fit with sin? And a really interesting discussion on that one. But what it seemed to me is that shame and blame are the surrogates of death in the world. The surrogates of death are sin. The surrogates of death are sin. And the way we blame, it's part of the deforming features of the death-tending ways of the world. It's part and parcel of the cyclical thing that happens with us because we get it inscribed on us, shame and blame, and then we reinscribe it on others. Two of my primary degrees are in ethics, and it got me thinking about ethics and ethical law codes and social mores, and it got me wondering whether oftentimes that social mores, ethics, is simply a mask for blame and shame. Simply a mask for it. So, certainly social mores can be that. The excluding ones. The way we divvy up the world between not only haves and have not, but acceptable and unacceptable, loved and not loved. We do that. Social mores do that all the time. Paul understood that. I wonder if this has really interesting application to Paul and his understanding of Torah, because he had two different understandings of Torah, or the law. Now, Torah, don't get confused by that word. It's the Jewish word for the law given to Moses at Mount Sinai. We see it as captured in the Ten Commandments, not collapsed there by any means. Jewish understanding of Torah is very encompassing. It's the Torah spoken of in Psalm 119, the way of God, the law of God, summarized in the Great Commandment. It's the way of God in the world. According to Paul, there are two understandings of it. One can be narrow and exclusive and death-tending. The other is life-giving. The death-tending ways of Torah Paul addresses in the book of Galatians with Jewish identity codes that are necessary for Christians if they're actually going to be accepted by God. He says that's the identity codes are circumcision and kosher, or those kinds of things, the kind of things that for some might exclude others, Jews from Gentiles. Paul says no. He rejects that kind of exclusivist, negative, blaming and shaming understanding of Torah, and points toward a life-giving understanding of Torah that for him is given in the Spirit of Christ to live out of the life of Christ, who shatters the death-tending ways of the world and its grip on us. And so he has these two categories that Paul works with that are very confusing in some ways: flesh and spirit, the life of the flesh, the life of the spirit. Life of the flesh is not about the physical body. Paul is not anti-body, that's very anti-Jewish, and Paul would not do that. Flesh here is a code word for sin. Is a code word for sin. It's how sin takes the body and distorts it. And it can do that with law. It can do that with virtually anything. Everywhere it looks, it can take it. Law codes, wherever it goes, it can take it and distort it. But when the Spirit is given, it opens it up. It loosens the grip, if you will, of shame and blame, and opens us up for the fruit of the Spirit, as Paul talks about in Galatians 5, which is love, peace, joy, generosity, forbearance of one another, bearing one another's burdens. It's openness. It's that which gives life. And how does this transfer occur? It's critical to get at that. It's a gift of the Spirit. It's a gift of the Spirit. And Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 6, right before kind of building up to the argument in Romans 8, when he talks about baptism into the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. We're baptized in the life of Jesus, into the death of Jesus. All the old stuff is shattered, so that we can be freed. Its grip on us, which is almost an iron grip, is loosened, so that we can be in the process of being freed for life and love, shame-free, blame-free. And that reminds me that we're doing a baptism today. Because this is a corporate thing. It's not just an individual thing. Again, Paul has very few injunctions that are simply for the individual. It's almost always for the community. It's always for the world. And so it's a community of faith. That's why we always do a baptism in a corporate worship. Because it's really important for us to do it in worship. Because the only way with this transfer can be made and the power of the Spirit can become effective in us is as a collective. The power of the people, if you will, God working in our midst. And so we do a baptism here, and promises are made to the child, Harley Ann, later in our baptism. These are the most potent promises, I will tell you, that you will ever make, because they're about who you are as a child of God, as one of God's own. You're not on your own, and you're not your own. You are God's. And the power of the Spirit has loosened the grip of sin and death on you, on us. And in the power of community, it can be realized fully, because it's all about bearing one another's burdens. It's all about being with one another, serving one another and the world. It's about being lifted to life. That's what baptism is about, being lifted to life, and a symbolism of the power of life. This is what I call cruciform spirituality, because it's the spirituality of the cross, dying and rising, sin loosening its grip on us. It's about the irony of the Christian faith, which is that real life comes as we face into the brokenness of the world, the wounds, the shame, if you will, the blame, and therein find the God who is resurrecting life in us and in community. Therein we find the God who is bringing us from life to death, and in the process of creating community and in healing the world. And so I invite you to hear just a little bit of a paraphrase of Romans 8. So therefore, and this is what it's there for. There is now no condemnation, no blame, no shame for those who are in Christ. For the one who raised Jesus Christ from the dead can give life to your mortal bodies and free you to live for others, for God, and for yourself. So here's the new credo. No blame, no shame. Simply faithful responsiveness to the Spirit of God who is giving us life. Amen.